After the passing of Louis Gossett Jr. in 2024, his once-beloved Malibu home where he had spent his final years was sold to a young couple, Mark and Olivia Reynolds. Drawn to the house for its breathtaking ocean views and Hollywood history, they had no idea that their dream home would soon turn into a waking nightmare. At first, the disturbances were subtle lights flickering for no reason, doors creaking open in the middle of the night. Olivia brushed it off as the house settling, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then came the cold spots, lingering in the hallway near the grand piano, an area where, according to old photographs, Gossett Jr. used to sit and reflect. One night, while unpacking in the master bedroom, Olivia swore she heard a whisper. It was low and gravelly, almost familiar. She turned to Mark, thinking he had spoken, but his expression was frozen in horror. "I heard it too," he whispered. The real terror began when they invited friends over for dinner. Midway through the evening, the radio suddenly turned on by itself, playing jazz, Gossett Jr.'s favorite genre. The guests laughed it off, but Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. When he went to turn the radio off, he swore he saw a shadow move across the kitchen doorway. One night, unable to sleep, Olivia walked downstairs to get some water. As she reached the bottom step, she saw a figure, faint and hazy, standing by the piano. The shape was tall, imposing, yet peaceful. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke. She stood frozen in place, staring at the apparition. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Determined to find answers, the couple reached out to a paranormal investigator. Upon visiting, the investigator noted a strong energy in the house, particularly in the study where Gossett Jr. had spent much of his time writing. A séance was held, and when asked if the spirit had a message, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. A single word came through on the recording device: stay. Unlike the stereotypical haunted house stories where spirits demand their intruders to leave, this one was different. Mark and Olivia soon realized that whatever presence lingered in the house was not malevolent. The strange occurrences, music playing at random, the scent of cigars, the faint sound of a deep voice humming in the night felt more like a reminder than a warning. Perhaps they thought Louis Gossett Jr. had never truly left. Some say the couple still lives there, coexisting with the presence of the legendary actor. Others claim they left the house after one final, chilling encounter, a night when Mark woke up to see the full apparition of Gossett Jr. sitting in his old chair, smiling, before fading into the darkness. The ocean wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass in its frames as if whispering secrets from the past. Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his breath shallow, his heart pacing against the quiet rhythm of the night. Beside him, Olivia's breathing was soft and steady, undisturbed by the uneasy feeling that had kept him from sleep for weeks now. He listened, always waiting for the familiar flicker of something just beyond his understanding, for the scent of old cigars curling into the air without explanation. Downstairs, the piano keys shuddered with the faintest of vibrations, a single note pressing into existence, then silence. Mark closed his eyes. Perhaps he had imagined it, as he had imagined so many things since moving here. But when he opened them again, the room felt different, heavier, filled with a presence that had no face, no form, and yet was as tangible as the walls enclosing them. He sat up, careful not to wake Olivia, and swung his legs over the edge of the bed. The floor was cold beneath his feet, colder than it should have been, as if the warmth of life itself had been drained from the wood. He rose slowly, hesitantly, and moved toward the doorway, compelled by something he could not name. Each step creaked beneath his weight, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive stillness of the house. As he descended the stairs, the shadows seemed to shift, stretching longer than they should, bending unnaturally across the walls as if they were alive. The living room was bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the windows, casting long, eerie shapes across the furniture. Then he saw it. The piano bench was pulled out, slightly askew, as if someone had just been sitting there. The air smelled of something familiar, aged leather and wood polish, the faint trace of something earthy and deep, like the lingering presence of a man who had walked through a room mere moments before. Mark's fingers trembled as he reached out, touching the piano keys lightly. The sound rang through the house, clear and crisp, but as the note faded, something else took its place. A breath, soft, steady, unmistakably human. Mark turned sharply, his pulse roaring in his ears. There was nothing, no one, but he felt it. A weight in the air, a presence standing just behind him, unseen yet undeniably there. He opened his mouth to call out, to demand an answer, but before he could speak, the lamp in the corner flickered violently. Then, a voice, low, deep, roughened by time and experience. It wasn't angry, wasn't threatening, but it held something firm, something knowing. You should listen. Mark's blood turned to ice. His body refused to move, his limbs locked in place by a force greater than fear. He wanted to run, to shake Olivia awake, to get out of this house and never return. But something held him there. The air shifted, the scent of cigar smoke thickening for just a moment before dissipating like mist in the wind. The piano bench creaked softly, as if a weight had just been lifted from it. Then silence. But Mark knew this was only the beginning. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The silence that followed was vast, swallowing every sound, stretching the moment into something unnatural. Mark stood motionless, his breath slow, measured, but inside, his pulse was hammering, his body frozen between reason and the creeping weight of something unseen. The room around him remained unchanged, no shifting shadows, no spectral figures lingering at the edges of his vision. And yet, the air was different. The house had always felt vast at night, its dark corners deeper than they should be, its walls seeming to stretch outward, but now it felt smaller, tighter, as if something unseen had drawn itself closer to him. He forced himself to turn his head, scanning the room, his gaze catching on the faint reflection in the blackened glass of the window. His own silhouette stood there, rigid and pale in the dim light, but was that all? Something flickered, just at the edge of his reflection. A suggestion of movement, so fleeting it could have been a trick of his sleep-deprived mind. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, and took a step back. The wooden floor groaned beneath him, a sound that should have been familiar, ordinary. But then another step echoed his own, slightly delayed, slightly off, as if someone else was moving just behind him, mimicking his every motion a fraction of a second too late. Mark spun around. The room was empty. He let out a slow breath, forcing himself to exhale, to shake off the feeling that clung to him like a second skin. His rational mind grasped for an explanation. The old house settling. His nerves playing tricks on him. Sleep deprivation, maybe, but then he saw it. The cigar. It was sitting on the edge of the piano, unlit but unmistakable, its scent thick in the air. He hadn't seen it before. He was certain of that. The piano had been bare when they moved in nothing but polished wood and dust where time had settled. Mark reached out, his fingers hovering just above it. The paper wrapping was old, slightly crinkled, its texture too real, too tangible to be a hallucination. He pulled his hand back. From upstairs, a soft creak. Olivia was still asleep, wasn't she? He hadn't heard her stir, hadn't heard the rustling of blankets or the familiar sleepy sigh she made when shifting in bed. The sound came again. Not footsteps, no. Something slower, heavier. A weight shifting just beyond his line of sight. The bedroom door? He had left it open when he came downstairs. Hadn't he? The thought rooted him in place. He should go check. Should make sure she was still there, that no one was moving upstairs. But his legs wouldn't obey him. Something was waiting. He could feel it. The house had always been still at night, but this wasn't stillness. This was something watching, something listening, something holding its breath just as he was holding his. A shadow flickered at the top of the staircase. Just for a second. His breath caught, and then the whisper returned. Soft, low, impossibly close. You should listen. It was the same voice, the same words. But this time it wasn't coming from behind him. It was coming from upstairs. Mark's breath shallowed. his chest tightening as though the very air in the room had thickened, pressing against his ribs like unseen hands. The whisper still echoed in his ears, curling into the crevices of his mind, settling in a place he couldn't shake free. He turned his gaze upward. The staircase stretched before him, its wooden steps bathed in the pale silver glow of the moon filtering through the hallway window. The light should have made him feel safer, but instead, it only served to deepen the shadows that pooled at the top, swallowing the end of the corridor in a darkness too complete, too still. The sound had come from up there, from the bedroom, his bedroom, where Olivia still lay asleep. His legs felt stiff, unwilling, but something in him knew he had to move. He had to go up. The whisper had been close, impossibly close. He had felt it in his bones, as though the words had been breathed against his skin rather than spoken aloud. Slowly, he placed his foot on the first step. The wood beneath him groaned, the sound reverberating up the walls like a warning. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn back, to wake Olivia, to leave this house behind, but his body was no longer entirely his own. Some unseen force had settled over him, an urgency that pulled him forward despite the cold sweat dampening the back of his neck. Another step, then another. The house seemed different now. The air thicker, the walls closer. He could feel something shifting, something unseen watching him from the periphery of his vision, just beyond what his eyes could catch. His fingers grazed the wooden banister, gripping it tightly, grounding himself in the sensation of the cool, polished wood beneath his palm. Halfway up, he paused, straining his ears against the silence. Nothing, just the faint hum of the wind outside, the gentle rustling of the trees. But that wasn't right, was it? The whisper, he had heard it. Hadn't he? His heartbeat roared in his ears as he took another step. The hallway stretched before him now, longer than he remembered, the edges of the ceiling seeming to bend inward ever so slightly. The door to the bedroom was open just a crack, no wider than the width of 2 fingers. He didn't remember leaving it like that. Had Olivia? His pulse thrummed against his temples as he reached for the doorknob. The brass was ice-cold beneath his touch, sending a sharp chill up his arm. He swallowed hard, bracing himself for whatever lay beyond. The door swung open without a sound. The room was unchanged. Olivia lay curled on her side beneath the covers, her dark hair spilling over the pillow, the slow rise and fall of her chest the only sign of movement. But something was wrong. The air here was different, heavy, dense. Mark stepped inside, his breath shallow, his senses on high alert. The moonlight painted long, slanted bars across the bed, illuminating Olivia's face in soft silver. But just beyond the glow, in the farthest corner of the room, the shadows were thick, unmoving. Something was there. He knew it before he even saw it. And then, the darkness shifted. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't his mind playing games. The shadows unfurled, slow and deliberate, as though peeling themselves from the wall, revealing a form hidden within them. A shape, tall, still, watching. A breath left Mark's lips before he even realized he had been holding it. His body locked in place, his limbs unwilling to move. He knew that shape. Not from the living. Not from the world he had always known. It was him. The figure stood in the corner, unmoving, yet impossibly present. Not fully formed, not flesh and blood, but unmistakably there. His features obscured but somehow known to Mark in the deepest, most instinctual part of his being. The cigar scent was stronger now, curling through the air like a memory brought to life. Mark wanted to speak, to demand to know what this presence wanted. But his voice was gone. His throat was dry, his breath shallow. Then, he stepped forward. Only an inch. Only the smallest of movements. But it was enough. Mark stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs, his legs finally obeying him. His hand grasped the edge of the dresser for support, but his eyes never left the figure in the corner. And then, finally, it spoke. The same voice as before, low and unshaken, as steady as it had always been. You should listen. But this time, the whisper wasn't distant. It wasn't from the shadows. It was right beside him. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The voice was no longer a whisper from the dark corners of the house. It was close, impossibly close, as if spoken just beside his ear. The heat of it brushed against his skin, but when he turned, the air was empty. The figure in the corner had not moved, yet the presence, the weight of it was all around him now. A slow, creeping realization settled into his chest. This was not a ghost in the way he had once imagined them, not a flickering apparition confined to shadowed corners, but something stronger, something lingering, something rooted in this house as deeply as its very foundation. The voice had told him to listen. But listen to what? His pulse hammered as he forced his gaze back toward Olivia, still sleeping, undisturbed by the presence that now loomed over their home. He wanted to wake her, to shake her from whatever veil of ignorance was protecting her from this nightmare. But a part of him hesitated. What if she already knew? What if the house had whispered to her, too? Another step. The figure shifted again, its edges still blurred, still neither light nor shadow, but something in between. And then, for the first time, Mark could see it, truly see it. Louis Gossett Jr. stood before him, not in flesh, not as a mere ghost, but something else. A presence too strong to fade, too woven into the walls of this place to be erased by time. The lines of his face were soft but solemn, the weight of a life lived pressing into every feature. His dark eyes held something Mark couldn't decipher, a plea, a warning, a question. Mark's lips parted, his voice finally returning, weak and uncertain. What do you want? The air shifted. The scent of cigars and old leather thickened, wrapping around him like a memory made tangible. The figure did not speak, did not move, but suddenly, Mark knew. A flood of images filled his mind, flashes of moments that did not belong to him. A younger Louis, sitting in the very corner where the shadow had stood, bent over a leather-bound journal, writing in long, sweeping strokes. The creak of a rocking chair, the low hum of an old jazz tune drifting through the halls. Laughter, deep and rich, shared over a late-night drink. The weight of solitude in an empty house. The feeling of history being erased, of memories sinking into dust. Mark stumbled back, gasping. He was seeing the past. This house was not just haunted, it was remembering. And it needed someone to listen. Mark's eyes darted back to the piano. The cigar still rested there, untouched. He hesitated, then slowly reached for it, his fingers brushing against the rough paper. The moment he did, a warmth spread through his chest, not frightening, not oppressive, but understanding. The figure of Louis Gossett Jr. began to fade. But this time, Mark didn't feel fear. The presence was not leaving. Not entirely. It was simply settling. Not haunting. Staying. The whispers had never been a warning. They had been an invitation. A chance to remember. A chance to keep something alive. The house had been waiting for someone who would listen. And now it had found one. From that night on, the strange occurrences never truly stopped. The piano still played soft, distant notes in the quiet hours. The scent of cigars sometimes lingered in the air when no one had been smoking. And on the rarest of nights, when the wind rattled the windows and the house felt impossibly still, Mark could swear he heard a voice, deep, steady, filled with something like gratitude. He and Olivia never moved, and they never stopped listening. Over time, the house no longer felt haunted, not in the way Mark had once feared. It wasn't a place of dread, of restless spirits seeking vengeance or release. It was simply alive, a vessel for memories that refused to fade, for a presence too strong to be forgotten. Mark and Olivia adjusted in ways they never spoke about aloud. They left a chair open at the small table in the den, the same spot where Louis had once sat, gazing out at the ocean with a quiet intensity. They never moved the old cigar from the piano, allowing it to rest there as though waiting for its rightful owner to return. And sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings, Mark would sit at the piano and press a single key, waiting. More often than not, the air would shift just slightly, and another note would answer back. Neither he nor Olivia ever tried to explain it. Some things weren't meant to be understood, only accepted. The years passed, and the house remained. Friends visited, remarking on its warmth, on the strange comfort it seemed to offer despite its history. Mark would only smile, never confirming nor denying the stories people whispered about it. But late at night, when the house settled into its deepest silence, he would sometimes wake to the sound of soft footsteps in the hall, a shadow shifting in the corner of his vision, the faintest hum of a jazz tune, just on the edge of hearing. And he would smile, because he knew, without a doubt, that he was not alone.